The text that was just read is a vital text in our understanding what it means to be a disciple. Jesus has been with the 12 for quite some time, and yet they do not know who he really is. He's only months away from the cross, and so he now wants them to come to grips with his identity. And so he begins by asking some questions, and he's not really looking for information. He already knows what people think of him. But he asks, who do people say that I am? Sometimes as a teacher, when you ask questions knowing the answer, and knowing that you're going to get the wrong answer as to a question like this, then the truth can come shining through. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Who do people say that I am? And of course, people do not understand the true identity of this man named Jesus. And then he makes it personal when he asks the disciples themselves, now who do you say that I am? Now, the reason this question is so important is this. The way that you see Jesus determines what you do with Jesus. And so Jesus is ready now for his chosen 12 to come to grips with the reality of his identity. Who do you say that I am? At this time, there were basically three different groups and different understandings of Jesus. There were those who opposed Jesus, and I'm talking about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders of this day. And the way they viewed Jesus was that he's an imposter. He claimed to be the Christ, the Messiah, but he certainly could not be, they thought, because he doesn't fit the criteria of the Messiah in their way of thinking. So they saw him as a fraud, as an imposter, and as a result of the way they viewed Jesus, they hated him. In fact, they hated him so much they wanted him dead. In fact, in just a few months, they will have him dead. There's a second group, and I call these the multitudes that followed Jesus from place to place. And they had a rather superstitious idea of who he might be. And some of those ideas are given here. He could be John the Baptist. He was already dead. He might be one of the old prophets resurrected from the dead. So they had some kind of superstitious idea of Jesus. There was that business that Elijah would return from Malachi and his prophecy. But they didn't really understand that he was the Christ, the Son of God. They followed him. The multitudes liked to follow him, but only because of the great things that he did for them. He healed their sick. He made their lame to walk, their blind to see. He filled their bellies with food. And that's why they followed him. But they did not see him as the Son of God. The third group are the disciples, and Peter, I think, speaks for the disciples here in voicing their understanding of who Jesus is. You are the Christ, Peter says. That word Christ is the Greek term for the anointed one. Christ is the equivalent of the Messiah in the Hebrew language from the Old Testament. You're the Messiah, is what he's saying. But the disciples didn't even comprehend the Messiah. We read from Isaiah 53 earlier. That's a prophecy of the coming Messiah. He would suffer. And so Jesus begins talking about the suffering that he would go through in Jerusalem. And Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. Can you imagine that? Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is God in the flesh. And yet Peter rebukes him. He doesn't see him in his true identity. And the way you see Jesus determines what you do with Jesus. And so he treats him just like another man, maybe a good teacher. To be a disciple of Jesus, though, is to come to grips with the reality of who he is, his identity. If Jesus is just a good teacher, you can take him or leave him. But if he's the Son of God, if he is the Messiah, if he is God in the flesh, then we need to follow him. And so Jesus helps us to understand what it means to be a disciple and how to live the life of a disciple. He said there are three things that are required. You have to deny self, take up your cross, and then follow me. Those three things. People are confused about what Jesus means by those various elements of discipleship. When you see that expression, deny self, some people think that that means you deny yourself things. That is, if I want to become a Christian, I've got to give up drinking and cursing and carousing and all of that in order to be a Christian. Well, that's true, but that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about denying self. We understand this word deny by looking at Peter on the night that Jesus was betrayed. You remember that when Jesus was arrested there in the garden, that he followed at afar. He did not come close because of fear. And he followed the entourage of people that led Jesus into the courtyard of the home of the high priest. And Peter walks over to the fire and he begins to warm himself there among the soldiers that had arrested him. And there was one of the servants there that recognized Peter. And the servant said, "I know who you are. You're one of those Galileans. You were with him." And Peter, of course, denied it. He denied Jesus. He said, "I don't understand what you're saying. I do not know the man." That's denying. He denied Christ. He disowned him. And at that moment, Peter probably knew that the jig would be up if he didn't escape. And so he kind of eases his way toward the gate of the courtyard. When he reaches the gate, there's another servant there, a servant girl watching the gate. And she too said, "I know who you are. You're one of them." And the second time, Peter denies that he knew Jesus. He disowns him. He separates himself from the Lord. He knows he cannot escape, and so he tries to mingle with the crowd. And then one of the bystanders again says, "You are one of those Galileans. You were with him." And the Bible tells us now he began to curse in denying it. Now, I don't think that means that he used profanity, but rather it means that he was pronouncing a curse on himself if he were lying when he denied ever knowing Jesus. To deny means to disown. And Jesus is saying, if you want to be my disciple, you have to disown self. And that means you look at your past life, there it is in all of its sinfulness, and you step aside from your past life and you say, "I do not know that man." You deny that life. You're disowning that life. You're disowning what you once were. And you're saying, "I may have been that, but I'll never be that again." I deny knowing that man. That's what it means to deny self. Then secondly, Jesus says you must take up your cross if you're to be his disciple. And a lot of people are confused about that because we tend to think that the cross is just suffering. We even have the expression, "That's the cross I have to bear," meaning the suffering that we endure in life. If you were born an invalid, well, we say that's the cross I have to bear. Or if you were born blind or If you have some kind of predicament, that's the cross I have to bear, because it involves suffering. I was holding a meeting in another state several years ago, and I was being introduced and meeting people after the worship, and people were shaking my hand, and this woman introduced herself to me, and there was a little man standing behind her, just a little fella, and she pointed to him and she said, "And that's the cross I have to bear." It was her husband she was talking about. Well, that's not what bearing the cross means. In the New Testament, the cross was an instrument of death. They nailed people to hunks of wood to kill them. And so Jesus is saying, once you have disowned, denied self, what are you going to do with that old life? Jesus says, kill it. Be done with it. Put it on the cross and kill it. Now in Luke's rendition, his version of this same incident, Jesus says you take up your cross daily. And what he means by that is every day you carry your cross with you. And when your old self tries to resurrect itself in your life and tries to again take over and run your life, then you put him on the cross and you kill it. I wish that I could say that once you come out of the waters of baptism, having crucified self, that self stays dead for the rest of your life. But you and I know that self has that uncanny ability of resurrection. It keeps wanting to come back. And so Jesus says, take your cross with you every day and put self on the cross. And then the third thing that Jesus says is you follow me. And the tense of that in the Greek is to continue following me. Folks, it is not until you disown self and crucify self and silence the voice that has been guiding you all of your life that you're ready now to listen to a new voice, the voice of Jesus. And so we begin to follow our Lord. And we go in the direction that he takes us and he leads us. There's nothing mystical or magical about this, nothing supernatural. He speaks to us through the word that he's given to us. And so now we have committed our lives to following Jesus wherever he wants to take us. And we do everything that he wants us to do. That's the commitment that we make as a disciple. Now you may be sitting there this morning and say, well, you know, I've been baptized. I believe Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah. I follow him. Well, let's take a little test if you don't mind. The kids are back in school. They love tests, don't they? Don't you just like to take tests? Well, let me give you a 3-question test this morning, and it's based on what Jesus says in verses 35 through 38. Here's test question number 1. If called upon, would you be willing to give your physical life to die for Jesus? If you were in a situation where you had to either die or compromise, like in the first century, would you hold to your faith and go ahead and die? I understand that in the first century, some of those Roman soldiers would actually take a sword and put it to your throat, or maybe to the throat of your child. And they would say, you either say, Hail Caesar, or Hail Christos, Christ. And if you said that your allegiance was to Christ, they'd just run you through. Would you give your life for Jesus? Would you do that? Now you may think, preacher, we don't know what we're going to do in those situations. How can you know that? You might even point to Peter. Look at Peter. On the night that he denied Christ 3 times, he had actually said, Lord, I will go to prison for you. Lord, I'll die for you. And then he denied the Lord 3 times. And that's true, he did. But I believe that was before he truly knew who Jesus was. Later, after the day of Pentecost, Peter knows exactly who Jesus is. And tradition says that he was in Rome when he died. And he died a martyr's death. He suffered because of his faith in Christ. In fact, they were ready to crucify him. And he blurted out that he was not worthy to die the same manner as his Lord. And so they just turned him upside down and crucified him upside down. Peter knew who Jesus was. And that's why he was willing to die for the Lord. Here's test question number 2. If you could sell your soul and gain the world, would you do that? If you could somehow make a deal with the devil and belong to the devil, sell your soul so that you gained all the material prosperity in the world, would you be willing to do that? It's kind of interesting how money is nowadays. I learned yesterday, listening on the radio as I was driving toward Ulaga, that there are football players who have contracts in 9 figures. That's the hundreds of millions of dollars. And the contract is for like 6 or 7 years, and they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a lot of money, isn't it? But folks, that is chump change. That's peanuts compared to the whole world. Do you think you'd be tempted to sell your soul for a lot of money? You know, the devil never tempts us with the whole world. Never. It's only our little corner of the world that he tempts us. And there are some men who actually put their careers before the Lord. Oh, I've got to make enough money. I've got to support my family. I've got to do this. I've got to keep my business going. I don't have time to be there every time the doors are open to worship or to study the Bible. I don't have time to read my Bible every day. I don't have time to pray to God. And so they make a deal with the devil and have sold their soul for just a little piece of the world. Here's the third question that Jesus asked of us. Have you ever been ashamed of Jesus? Jesus wants us to be proud of him. Have you ever found it difficult to open up a Bible conversation with someone? Or just to mention the name of Jesus to your non-Christian friends? Do you find it rather, shameful to carry your Bible with you when you go to work, or to let people see that you read the Bible, or that you pray at a meal? Sometimes when I talk to teenagers, I talk about the idea of being a coward. You know, when I was a kid, they used to call you a sissy, if you wouldn't do what the other guys did. My dad moved us when I was a senior in high school to St. Paul, Minnesota from the Dallas, Texas area. And up there, they didn't use the word sissy. It was a wimpy. It was a wimp if you didn't go along with the crowd. But I tell you, the one who's the real coward, the sissy, the wimp, is the one who refuses to stand up for what he knows is right, and he goes along with the crowd. He's afraid. He's a coward to stand up and say, this is wrong. Have you ever been ashamed of Jesus so that you compromised in some way? Jesus says if we're ashamed of him in this evil and adulterous generation, he's going to be ashamed of us when he returns with the angels. of heaven. You're getting the idea that discipleship is a little bit more than being baptized and then bringing our bodies to a building to worship. You see, discipleship has to do with giving yourself totally to Jesus. To deny, to disown self, to crucify that old life, that old will that used to lead your life, and then to follow Jesus every day. Let me tell you a story that I think illustrates what Jesus is saying here. A man gets up in the morning and he crawls out of bed and he goes into the bathroom to shave and to shower and to get ready for the day. And he looks into the mirror and he sees a reflection of Christ. This man's a Christian. He gets dressed for the day and he goes out into the kitchen and he makes his own lunch because he wants the wife to sleep in a little longer. They had a long weekend. It's Monday morning and she needs her rest. I'm letting her sleep this morning and I'll make my own lunch. He puts a sandwich together and grabs some chips and throws in a thermos of coffee. And he grabs his jacket heading out the back door. And right by the back door, there's an old, rugged, wooden cross. And he grabs the cross, throws it over his shoulder and heads out, throws the cross into the van and gets out on the highway and heads toward work. He's going into the big city to the factory to work. And he's happy because he's right with the Lord. He's singing hymns, looking forward to the day. And of course, the traffic on the highway begins to slow to a crawl, and he begins wondering what's going on today. Is there an accident up there, or someone was pulled over by the police? What's going on? And as he crawls along, he sees up ahead there's a vehicle off to the side, and the hood is raised because there's a problem. And no one is stopping to help the man. As he gets closer, he sees a man with 3 little children in tow. And the man is in a business suit and a tie, and no one is stopping to help. And the Christian looks at his watch and he says, you know, if I stop to help, I'll be late. And the boss will chew me out again. It might have grave consequences. I better not stop. And then he hears the voice of Jesus say, it's time for you to die. And so he crawls on that old cross and crucifies self. And his old self-will dies. And he listens now to the voice of Jesus. And so he pulls off to help the man, and he discovers that the man ran over something in the highway. He's got 2 flat tires. He's late for his own business appointment. The children will be late to school. They're waiting on him at the office for a presentation. And so the Christian says, look, I've got a buddy who owns a tow truck. I'll call him. He owns a service station. He'll fix the flats. He'll come out and get the car. I'll have him bring the car to your place of business. Your kids go to the same school that my children go to. I know exactly where it is. I'll take them for you. So he takes the man to this place of business, takes the children to their school, calls his buddy to get the tires fixed, and then he shows up to work late. And sure enough, the boss chews him out, but he just smiles because he knows he's done the will of the Lord and helped this man. He goes through the day happy. But you know, he begins to notice that ever since he became a Christian, the other guys that work at the factory kind of leave him alone. He used to sit and eat with them at lunch, but you know, they're always talking about the latest dirty joke, and he didn't want to be a part of that anymore. And so he didn't sit with them at lunch. He brought his Bible and read his Bible during lunch. He used to go with them after work down to Joe's bar for a few beers before going home. But he doesn't do that anymore now that he's a Christian. And he hears them mocking him. And they say to him, "Why do you carry that old cross with you wherever you go? Why do you go to that church so many times? You go 3 times a week, twice on Sunday and Wednesday. And when Orbison is in town, you go every night of the week. Why do you do that? Why do you let that church run your life like that?" And so he's losing his friends. The next morning he's up. Same thing, he makes his lunch, heads out the door, grabs the cross, heads to his van, throws the cross in, goes to work. Every day he's happy. He knows he's right with the Lord. He knows where he's headed. They hear on the loudspeaker at the factory that day, "Fellas, we got a situation here. Bill here has just learned that he lost his mother, and he's got to leave and go make arrangements for the funeral and be with the family. He was scheduled to work this Saturday, and he's not going to be able to work. We need someone to volunteer to take his place." Well, nobody ran to volunteer. And the Christian looks at himself and his calendar, and he said, "You know, I was planning to play some golf this weekend, and I really don't want to work on Saturday, even though I know it'd help old Bill out." And then he hears the voice of Jesus say, "It's time for you to die." And so he crawls on the cross, crucifies his old self-will, and listens to the voice of Jesus. So he worked on Saturday. Boy, he's tired. Sunday morning, he wakes up and he says, "You know, I have worked a lot this week. I think I'll just skip Bible class, and maybe I'll just take the family to the lake, and we'll come back in Sunday night, and I'll catch the Lord's Supper Sunday night." And then he hears the voice of Jesus say, "It's time for you to die." And so his old self-will is crucified, and the voice of Jesus wins out. He gets the kids ready, and they all go to Bible class, and then they worship, and they have a great day in praising the Lord. Every day he grabs the cross and takes it with him. But every day he is mocked by his former friends. And one morning, as he heads out the back door, he looks at that cross and he decides, "You know, I think I'll just leave it home today." And he goes to work without it. And while he's at work, the guys invite him over for lunch. "Oh, Jeffrey's got a new joke he's going to tell us at lunchtime. It's a real zinger. It's a dirty joke." And he hears the voice of Jesus say, "It's time for you to die." But he didn't have his cross. And so the Christian's old self-will won out that day. He joins the guys at lunch. They laugh it up at all of the carousing going on there. They said, "Why don't you join us for a beer after we're all going down to Joe's bar?" And the voice of Jesus said, "It's time for you to die." But he didn't have the cross. And again, his own will, his old self, won out. And he went with the guys after work to the bar. And he drank a few too many beers. And he staggered his way home. The next morning, it was easier not to take the cross. And the morning after that, it was even easier not to take the cross with him. In just a matter of days, he was back to his old self. When Sunday rolled around, he found excuses for not going to church. And his old will won out. This went on for weeks and weeks, and finally on one Saturday, he looked in the corner there by the back door, and he stared at that old hunk of wood, and he said, "I'm ashamed of that. and he picked it up, and he took it out to the garage, and he opened a storeroom, and he put the cross in there and covered it with a tarp, and he locked that room, and he never carried the cross again. He continued to work for a few years until age of retirement, and he said, "Man, this is what we've been working for all of our lives, dear." And they bought an RV and they began to travel. "This is living," he said. And then he got too old to travel. And then he got too old to even leave the house. And then he died. And then he stood before the judgment seat of Christ. And he hardly wanted to face him because he knew that he was ashamed of Jesus. "Where were you," Jesus said, "when I needed you, when I called for you? There were people there at that factory where you worked that would have been my disciple had you mentioned my name to them. Why did you turn a deaf ear to my calling out to you? And because you were ashamed of me and that evil and adulterous generation, I am ashamed of you now in the presence of God and these angels." Discipleship will cost you something. In fact, folks, it will cost you everything. Who do you say Jesus is? What does your life say that you believe about Jesus? Have you given your life to him? Jesus stands at the door and knocks. We're going to sing about that. Have you really let him into your life? Or do you still run things there? Jesus calls upon us to disown self, deny self, take up our cross, and follow him. We're going to offer the invitation of Jesus to come. If we can help you in any way spiritually, come to the front. Let us assist you while we stand together and sing this song.